There is a road that threads through the hills, a quiet ribbon of tarmac that most maps only hint at, the sort of lane that forgets to be straight and never apologizes. On a winter evening, it keeps to itself, shoulders lifted in drifts of snow, hedgerows powdered white, trees leaning in like kindly neighbors. If you know the way, you simply follow the dark line ahead until the world softens into silence and breath. If you do not know the way, you trust the hush to guide you. On this night, with December almost fully itself and Christmas near enough to taste in the air, a traveller moved slowly along that road. He had not meant to be travelling late, nor to be travelling at all in such weather. But the day had drifted sideways, and the snow had fallen faster than forecasts promised, and the distance he had planned to cross had stretched like a yawn. He kept his hands gentle on the steering wheel, eyes patient rather than urgent, accepting that he would go no quicker than the evening allowed. The world wore its winter carefully, fields pressed flat beneath their white blankets, stone walls softened to rounded shoulders, farm gates etched in hoar frost. Even the sky had lowered itself to a quiet grey, the sort that makes its own light. It was the kind of evening to be inside, to be near a kettle, to be wrapped in an old jumper, to be thinking about nothing more than whether you might have a mince pie before or after the washing up. It was not, truthfully, an evening to be anyone's guest but your own. And yet the traveller went on, because life sometimes asks you to pass through the season before you can arrive at it. He told himself he was fine. He had driven in snow before. He knew the trick of it. Small corrections, no sudden decisions. Let the car be its own careful animal. Still, the miles slowed until he found himself rarely changing gear, content to stay in the rhythm he was in, content to notice the things that people only see when they are moving very slowly. A robin hopping along a blackthorn branch, the tiny prints of a hare crossing the lane and disappearing into a hedge, smoke turning blue as it rose from a chimney and melted into the sky. He began to think of stopping, not dramatically. Just the thought of a place where a light might be burning, where windows might glow in that particular golden way they do in winter, as if warm hands were being pressed against the glass. A place with the uncomplicated welcome of a door that opens and a voice that says, "Come in, you must be cold." He did not need much. He needed enough. It happened, as it often does in such stories, that just when the thought arrived, the road agreed with him. The hedges fell back, and the lane widened a little, curving around to reveal a low stone building set slightly below the road, as if the house had crouched down to be out of the wind. 2 lanterns flanked the door, their glass dimpled with old bubbles, and snow had been swept from the steps in a generous arc, as though the broom had been wielded with a fondness for people arriving. A sign, its paint worn but dignified, swung gently from an iron bracket, the snowbound inn. The traveller smiled in spite of himself at the name. It seemed to be teasing the evening rather than complaining about it, as if the inn had made friends with winter long ago. He drew up beside the low wall and switched off the engine. The sudden quiet was a kindness he hadn't realized he wanted. He watched his breath blur the window and for a small moment simply sat, feeling the strangeness of being the one person inside a pocket of warmth, while the world around him rearranged itself into drifts and stars. When he stepped out, the snow yielded with that soft compression that is more sound than silence. The cold kissed his face and made his eyes water in a way that felt clean, as though the evening were reminding him to be present. He made his way to the door, noticed the wreath, rosemary, bay, and a few pine cones settled like sleeping birds, and lifted the latch. The smell met him first. Baked apples, a thread of cinnamon, a whisper of wood smoke, and something else he could not name that was simply home. Inside, the light was low and kind. The entrance opened into a room that seemed to have been thinking about people for a very long time. Beams crossed the ceiling like old arms. A settle ran along one wall, cushions faded by 1,000 shoulders. The floor was flagstone, warmed here and there by rugs that looked like they had been chosen not for matching, but for remembering. There was a counter at the far end with a brass bell that didn't need to be rung because the person who kept the inn had already noticed him. "Evening," she said, appearing from a doorway, as if she had been in conversation with the building, and it had reminded her that someone had arrived. She was in that ageless category that belongs to people who live in tune with cycles rather than calendars. Her hair was pinned up in a way that suggested it had been let down and pinned up again throughout the day as the weather changed its mind about the wind. Her smile started in her eyes and moved outward. "You must be frozen. Come in. Leave your boots by the mat. They'll dry quicker there. Can I take your coat?" "Thank you," he said, and immediately found that the words were warmer to speak than he had expected. "I didn't mean to be out in this." "No one means to be out in it," she said, easing him of his coat as though it were a worry as much as a garment. "But here you are, and here we are. We do hot cider and a very decent pot of tea, a bowl of soup too, if you like, and rooms, of course, if the road keeps you." He looked at her, a little taken aback by how easily his evening had been solved. "Tea would be perfect," he said, "and perhaps the soup." "Of course. Sit where you like. That corner's best if you want to watch the weather. That one's best if you want to forget it." She nodded towards 2 different tables and then to a third by the fire. "And that's best if you want to thaw your bones and do absolutely nothing at all." He chose the table by the fire. The chair welcomed him as if others had taught it how to recognize tiredness and be gentle with it. He stretched his fingers towards the warmth and found himself unspooling a little, like someone undoing a scarf after a long walk. He listened to small noises, the soft clink of crockery, the sigh of the kettle, the mutter of logs shifting as they settled. It was the kind of room where quiet arranges itself, where silence is a sign of contentment rather than absence. When the tea and soup came, they were accompanied by a slice of bread that looked like it had been made by hands that had learned the language of dough before they learned to write. The traveller ate and felt steadiness return to him in comfortable layers. The soup tasted of roots and patience. The tea reminded him of mornings when the day had not yet begun and there was still time to decide what it might be. "Will you be staying?" the innkeeper asked, as if the question were a shawl she placed around his shoulders. "If you have a room," he said. "I think the road would prefer I did." "The road is often wiser than we are," she replied. "Yes, we've a room. It's small, but the ceiling remembers summer and the sheets remember sunlight. That's usually enough." He smiled at that and nodded. She gave him a key attached to a small wooden fob worn smooth by other hands. Up the stairs and left, the room with the holly carved on the door. He thanked her and made his way up the narrow staircase, which had been climbed by so many steps that it had turned creak into a greeting. The corridor was lit by lamps with muted shades, and the air smelled faintly of beeswax and orange peel. When he found his room, he paused for a moment to notice the carving, 3 leaves and a cluster of berries, simple and certain. Inside, the room was exactly as promised. The bed sat under a sloping roof, a patchwork quilt lying over it like a quiet hymn. A small window looked out onto the garden where the snow had arranged itself into soft shapes, and the gate breathed in slow, quiet movements as the wind spoke to it. There was a jug and basin on a washstand, both with a mismatched pattern of blue flowers. A chair waited beside a little table on which sat a bowl of clementines, their scent like small suns. He set his bag down and touched the quilt with the back of his hand, as if checking the temperature of a memory. He realized, standing there, that he had been travelling for more than one day. Not along this road, and not always by car. Perhaps he had been travelling for months, perhaps years. Perhaps this was not a journey towards a place at all, but towards rest. He sat on the bed and let the thought arrive fully, without argument. It felt like truth. After a while, he went back downstairs, pulled by the feeling that the evening had not finished telling him what it had to say. The common room had welcomed a few more souls, a couple who spoke in quiet voices, finishing each other's sentences in comfortable halves. An elderly man reading a book with a candle at his elbow, as if the light were an old friend keeping him company. A woman knitting something soft that grew in her hands like a small field. No one looked like a stranger. The inn had a way of introducing people without using names. The traveller found a corner again and rested his gaze on nothing in particular. The innkeeper moved among her tasks, refilling a teapot here, adjusting a draught there, with the satisfied grace of someone who knows exactly what has to be done and exactly how to do it. She paused once to adjust a picture frame that had tilted slightly on the wall. It was an old photograph, sepia and formal, of the inn long ago, when the sign hung lower and the garden was a little wilder. Underneath, in copperplate hand, was written, "When the road decides for you." He looked from the photograph to the window, where the snow had thickened to that happy, hush-making kind of fall that draws people closer to one another. A clock somewhere chimed the hour in a voice that had learned subtlety over the years. Time did not so much pass here as gently change its position in the room. The elderly man closed his book and looked to the innkeeper. "Will there be a story tonight?" he asked, as if the tradition were an old garment taken out of a chest each winter and shaken into life. The innkeeper smiled. "There is always a story when the weather requests one," she said. "It keeps the house warm and reminds the doors what they're for." She looked around the room. "If no one minds, I'll tell it in here. At Christmas we sometimes go to the snug, but tonight feels like a wide evening." The room made consenting noises. A chair shifted, a cup set down, a stockinged foot tucked under a knee. The traveller noticed how everyone prepared to listen, how pre-listening is its own kind of stillness. He wondered if he might leave, go to his room, put himself straight to sleep, but he found he wanted, very much, to hear whatever story the inn thought should be told. The innkeeper sat near the fire, not on the big chair that might have been assumed to be the storyteller's throne, but on a low stool as if she were a student among friends. She folded her hands and looked at the flames as though asking them to keep rhythm. When she began, her voice was the kind of voice that seemed to be passing on what the walls already knew. "This house began as a cottage," she said, "a single room and a loft, a hearth and a table, a door that stuck in summer and swelled in winter. The lane outside was no lane then, just a track between one necessary place and another. People came by because the land told them to, and sometimes the weather insisted they stayed. The first keeper of this place was a woman called Unwind. She had hair the colour of wheat straw and strength in her wrists from kneading dough and carrying buckets. She kept a kettle simmering at all times and considered it an insult to the day if someone came by and left without having their hands warmed around a cup. In those times, travellers carried their stories with them like bread, and Unwind would offer a slice of one in return. That's how this house learned to listen. One winter, the story says it was a true winter, a winter that knew its own name. The snow fell and did not stop. Sheep became rounded humps in the fields. The ash tree by the gate became a sculpture of itself. People measured their days by the making of paths, and the paths had to be remade every morning. Unwind did what Unwind always did. She made soup and bread and fed anyone who knocked. But on the third day of the fall, no one came, and she began to worry about the old man who lived alone on the far side of the ridge. She wrapped herself in what she had, a coat, a shawl, courage. She took with her a lantern and a basket, in which she placed a jar of broth still hot from the stove, 2 slices of bread, a little cheese wrapped in cloth, and an orange. The orange had been given to her by a peddler in autumn in exchange for a bed by the fire, and she had saved it for Christmas. But she looked at the orange and she thought of the old man, and she knew that Christmas comes wherever it is needed. She set out. The track had disappeared into the world's whiteness, but she knew the way by heart. She counted her steps and listened to the wind telling her where the hedges were. She held the lantern low so the light found the ground, and when the gusts shook it, she steadied it like a child. When she reached the old man's cottage, she found that the door would not open. Snow had made itself comfortable against it, and the latch was stubborn with frost. She knocked and called out, and after a long moment she heard the frail thread of his voice. He had fallen, he said. He could not reach the door. Anwen set the lantern down. She did not hesitate. She used her hands to scoop snow away, to shape it into blocks and push them aside. She stamped and leaned and breathed until her breath made small clouds before her lips, and finally the door shifted. She slid inside like a gust of warmth, went straight to him and helped him to sit. She fed him spoon by spoon until colour returned to his cheeks, and he looked at her as if the world had composed itself correctly again. Later, when the wind fell and the snow stepped back a little, she helped him to the inn. She made a bed for him near the fire and fed him small, steady meals. He stayed until the thaw, and every year after, when the first frost came, he would bring her a little packet of orange peel saved from Christmas, dried and tied with string, and he would say, "For the kettles of the winter to come." Anwen would put the peel in the jar on the shelf, and when a day needed a little extra courage, she would add a strip to the pot, and the whole house would smell of sunshine. And so the house learned, the innkeeper finished softly, that sometimes it must go out into the weather to bring Christmas back inside. The room rested in the story for a while. The traveller felt something rearrange itself in him as quietly as snow settling on a sill. He saw, as if from a gentle distance, the years he had spent going forward, always forward, as if the world only existed in the direction of progress. He had begun to suspect, these past months, that there was another way to travel, inward, homeward, downward, into stillness. He had not known how to begin. Now it seemed he did not have to. The house would show him. "Will there be carols?" asked the woman with the knitting, the wool folded into her lap like a small creature asleep. "Not to sing," she added, "just to remember." The innkeeper smiled and shook her head very slightly, not in refusal but in a different kind of kindness. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight I think the silence wants the lead. But there is pudding." There was, and it arrived modestly, without ceremony, a tray of small bowls with a warm crumble, apples and pears, and a few winter blackberries that had been tucked in the freezer when no one was looking. Cream followed, and the murmurs people made when something delicious met a need at exactly the right time. The traveller ate his slowly, feeling the simple comfort of sweet and soft and warm. When he had finished, he went to the window and looked out. The snowfall had calmed to a faint sift, as if someone were sifting sugar through a fine sieve. He could see the garden gate lean and right itself in the thoughtful wind, and beyond it the lane became an idea rather than a fact. The world had simplified itself to inside and outside, and both were at peace. The elderly man who had asked for a story had risen and was carefully pulling on a coat that looked older than some histories. He caught the traveller's eye and smiled. "First time at the Snowbound?" he asked. "Yes," the traveller said, "though it feels like I might have been here before." "That's the trick of it," the man said. "The inn keeps a room ready for anyone who needs it, and it leaves a small part of that room in you when you go. So when you return, you recognize the space. It makes coming and going easy." "Do you live nearby?" the traveller asked. "Near enough and far enough," the man replied. "Close enough to walk when the snow allows it, far enough that the walk teaches me something. I come each winter to remember that the year is not just a list of tasks, it is a circle, and circles do not rush." The traveller nodded, as if receiving instructions on how to handle a delicate instrument. The elderly man lifted a hand in a brief farewell and stepped carefully towards the door. The innkeeper appeared, as if doors were her responsibility, and helped him with his scarf in a gesture so familiar it must have been repeated many times over many winters. When the door opened, Night leaned in like a friend, breathed a cool hello, and then was gently kept outside as the door settled again. "Would you like anything else?" the innkeeper asked the traveller as she returned to the hearth. "A book, perhaps, or an extra blanket?" "I think I have everything," he said. "But I wonder, could you tell me one more thing? The photograph with the writing underneath, what does it mean when the road decides for you?" She followed his glance to the frame and nodded. "My grandmother wrote that," she said. "She ran the inn through the kind of years that demand more courage than most. She always said people believe they choose their destinations, but often the road chooses the pauses. When the weather changes, when a plan falls through, when a car coughs and refuses to go another mile, those are the road's decisions. She told me never to ignore them. We are meant to pay attention to the pauses. They are the places where we are given back to ourselves." The traveller felt the truth of this like warmth arriving at his feet and travelling upwards. He had paused, he realised, at many junctions. He had usually filled the pause with noise, with advice, with plans, with the bright twitching of screens. He had rarely allowed a pause to be a pause. Perhaps that was why the year had felt long. Perhaps that was why he had ended up on this strange, gentle lane. The road had decided for him. He thanked the innkeeper and returned to his chair. The fire had settled into a steady glow. On the mantel stood 3 small cards decorated with sprigs of holly and handwriting in different inks. He imagined each card had travelled through days and sorting offices and letterboxes to stand there now, the proof of someone's thought crossing a distance. He thought of all the ways people send little pieces of themselves to each other at this time of year. A note, a recipe, a photograph, a handful of words that say simply, "I am thinking of you." In his bag upstairs, wrapped in a scarf, was a present he had been carrying for weeks without being able to deliver it. Circumstances had rearranged themselves, and the person he had intended it for was not where he had expected them to be. He had wondered whether to post it, whether to keep it, whether to admit to himself that the gift was not the point at all. Now, looking at the cards, he understood that gifts are often journeys disguised as objects. Perhaps the road would decide that journey too. Perhaps he could let it. The evening rounded itself gently. The couple finished their tea and smiled at each other in a way that suggested a lifetime of reliefs and small kindnesses. The knitter folded her work and placed it in a bag like laying a baby down to sleep. The innkeeper banked the fire with a practised hand and moved through the room, turning small switches that asked lamps to rest. The traveller stood and thanked her. "Sleep well," she said. "The house is good at that." Upstairs, the corridor greeted him with the soft hush of wood and wool and winter. His room was warmer than he had left it, as if the bed had been thinking of him and had arranged itself to be the shape of his tiredness. He washed his face in cool water that made him aware of being alive in a way that was pleasant rather than sharp. He peeled a clementine and let the scent rise, bright and clean, and placed the segments on the plate for morning. He undressed and slid beneath the quilt, which lay over him with the reassurance of something that knew how to keep people safe. He did not expect to sleep quickly. He expected the ordinary jostle of thoughts, but the house had its own persuasion, and the window let in a thin wash of night that encouraged his eyes to grow heavy. He listened to the faraway shuffle of the wind and the near quiet of his breath, and he drifted. In the kind of sleep that is a conversation rather than a plunge, he dreamed of the innkeeper's story. He saw Anwen's lantern moving steadily through the white. He saw the old man's cottage, with its stubborn door and its stubborn occupant whose life had to be coaxed back one spoon of broth at a time. He smelled the orange peel and felt its brightness like a small sun held in the palm. And he saw too the lane outside the inn and the gate breathing in and out with the wind. And he understood that all houses have lungs, and this one exhaled peace. When he woke, it was because morning had arrived in such a delicate way that it took him a moment to realize it had happened at all. The light had shifted from grey to pearl, and the air had that special quiet of early winter day when snow holds sound close. He felt rested in a way he had not expected to feel, not just in body, but in the part of him that usually hummed with plans. He lay for a while with his hands folded on the quilt, watching the small movements of brightness along the ceiling as the sun tried out different angles. Downstairs, the house had adopted its daytime voice. The smell of toast and coffee nudged the air. The traveller dressed and descended the stairs, which gave a different set of friendly creaks in the morning, as if acknowledging a night that had done its work. The common room was alive with the quiet happiness of breakfast, a newspaper rustling, a spoon tapping the side of a jam jar, the polite choreography of people sharing a table and finding they do not mind. The innkeeper was there, of course, as constant as a hearth, but never in the way. She brought him a pot of tea without asking, and he was surprised by how moved he was by being known so quickly and so easily. "Road's thinking about it," she said, nodding towards the window. The lane sparkled and the sky had put on a pale blue as if testing it. "If you want to go on today, you can. If you want to wait, you can." He considered, feeling the new spaciousness in him. "I think I'll wait," he said, "at least until the afternoon. There's nowhere I need to be before then, and I'd like to remember this properly rather than rush past it." "Good," she said. "Waiting is a kind of travelling." She placed a plate before him, eggs, hot and bright, a wedge of bread, a little dish of marmalade with peel cut thin. "Eat, then go and stand in the garden for a bit. The ash tree tells the truth in winter." He smiled at the image and did as he was told. After breakfast, he put on his coat and stepped outside. The cold met him without malice. The garden lay under its good blanket. The ash tree stood like a wise neighbour who had come to the fence not to gossip, but to remind you that weather and time are not the same. He breathed in and found the air tasted of clean beginnings. On the wall near the back door, he noticed a small wooden board on which a piece of chalk had written a few lines. The handwriting was the same as the caption beneath the photograph. He read it and felt the words settle calmly in his chest. "When snow insists on quiet, be quiet with it. When the year asks you to remember, look kindly back. When the road decides for you, take the gift without argument. There will be fires again and laughter and open windows. For now, rest. Rest is also a kind of work." He stood there for a while, the way one stands before a view, not for the sake of the view, but to let the view work on the part of you that needs it. Then he brushed a little snow from the top of the gatepost with his glove and watched the flakes tumble slowly to the ground, each taking its time as if it had nowhere better to be. Back inside, he found the innkeeper polishing glasses behind the counter. He thanked her for the board, although it felt odd to say thank you for something that was not exactly hers, nor exactly anyone's. "I like to put something there when the weather changes," she said. "It helps people understand what kind of day it is. Not just in the sky, but in themselves." He nodded, recognizing the truth in that as a person recognizes their reflection. He looked around the room, at the chairs and the light and the clock, and he understood that the inn was not merely a house in which to spend the night. It was a way of remembering how to be a person among other people in a world that is often too loud and too fast. It was a way of trusting that kindness and small, steady meals and end-of-day stories are not sentimental, but essential. The morning moved on. The couple said their goodbyes and stepped into the brightness together. The knitter returned, it seemed, for a forgotten bag, but perhaps simply because one does not have to explain one's reasons to a place that rents rooms to reasons. The elderly man arrived again, this time without his book, and took a chair by the window as if to continue a conversation with the light. At last, when the sun had lifted enough to show the contours of the lane and the frost had loosened its grip on the hedges, the traveller arranged his things. He paid his bill, though it felt less like paying and more like contributing money to the same generous bowl to which others had added over time. The innkeeper wrote his name in a ledger whose paper was thick enough to endure the years of names it had yet to receive. "Shall I keep your room for Christmas?" she asked lightly, half in jest, half in the way of a person who recognizes a returning soul when she sees one. "If the road decides so," he replied. "I think it might." He put on his coat and lifted his bag. At the door he paused, because leaving deserves its own attention. He looked back at the room, at the fire now speaking in its daytime voice, at the table where his cup had stood, at the picture on the wall with its quiet instruction. He nodded, the way a person nods at a friend when words would only get in the way. Outside, the air had softened from cold to crisp. He walked to his car, which looked faintly surprised to find itself still a car after a night under snowfall. He brushed the windscreen clean, cleared the lights, and climbed in. The engine started with a willing hum. He waited a moment, letting warmth begin its journey through the machine. Then he looked up at the inn and saw the innkeeper at the window. She lifted a hand. He lifted his in reply. The lane welcomed him back as if it had never once considered denying him. The car eased forward, tires finding grip in the certainty of daylight. He passed the ash tree which stood like a kindly sentinel, and the gate breathed its small breath. The fields lay white, but no longer hidden. The sky had opened blue enough to hint at the sea, though the sea was far away. He drove not quickly, not slowly, simply in step with the day. As he went, he found that what he was leaving, he was also taking. He carried the inn's quiet with him, and the story of Anwen's lantern and the chalked lines on the board. He carried the taste of apples and the suggestion that waiting is a kind of travelling. He carried the understanding that the road's decisions are not inconveniences but kindnesses disguised as detours. He thought of the gift in his bag and the person it was meant for. He did not know when the giving would happen or how, but the thought no longer fretted at him. It rested like a wrapped thing on a table, patient and proper. The lane joined another lane and then a road that had more opinions about where cars should be. He let each change happen without argument. He felt, for the first time in a while, ready for days to come. And somewhere behind him, under a sky that would be different every hour and yet always itself, the snowbound inn continued its work. The kettle sang, the fire moderated its glow, the doors argued gently with the weather and made their peace with it. The innkeeper moved through her rooms with the kind of attention that turns ordinary tasks into blessings. Someone arrived late, someone left early, someone sat in a chair and remembered how to breathe. The house listened, as it had always done, as it would always do. Christmas came, not all at once, but in little arrivals, a bowl of nuts placed on a side table, a ribbon tied around the peg of a door, an old carol hummed under someone's breath while carrying logs, the first orange cut at the kitchen table, and the scent going through the house like a bell rung softly. Outside, the lane wore its shawl and looked up at the stars when they allowed themselves to be seen. Inside, warmth organized itself into circles, around the hearth, around a table, around a bed, around the quiet heart of a person finding rest. If you were to ask the inn what it believed, if you were to speak to the beams or the rugs or the glass in the lanterns, they might tell you something like this, that winter is not a punishment but a promise, that stillness is not the absence of life but one of its forms, that kindness makes a place for itself wherever it is offered, that roads and weather and lives are always deciding for us in little ways, and that our part is to notice and say yes. And the traveller, well, the traveller drove on until the day lifted fully, and the hedges reduced themselves to ordinary distances, and the road lost its sense of being magical. He reached the next town, and then the next. He stopped for petrol and bought a small bag of clementines because the scent had told him to. He sent a message he had been meaning to send. He turned on the radio and turned it off again, preferring the quiet story that continued without needing sound. The year would go on. It would bring its appointments and its lists and its questions that could not be answered immediately. It would bring, too, its moments of grace, a kettle singing at exactly the right time, a letter arriving with a familiar hand, a person you love stepping into a room with their cheeks pink from the cold. He would take what he had learned, or rather what he had remembered, and plant it among the days like bulbs in a garden. He would trust that what rests now will flower when it is ready, and perhaps when the weather turned and the nights drew in again, when the first frost wrote its short poems on the windows, he would find himself on that lane once more. Not because he had planned it, but because the road had plans for him. He would see the lanterns by the door and the sweep of the steps and the sign moving just a little in the wind. He would lift the latch and step inside and hear the kettle asking the same lovely question it always asks. Tea? For now, though, the journey was enough. The car was warm. The day was honest. Christmas was more than a date waiting on the calendar. It was a place he had visited and could carry with him. He smiled softly and to himself, and the smile felt like being inside a house where someone has just put an extra log on the fire and said your name with affection. And if tonight, after all of this, you should find yourself at the edge of sleep, think of the inn, think of its door and its wreath, its blankets and its careful stairs. Think of the way rooms remember sunlight, and how bread can be a kindness, and how stories can move through a house like warm air. Think of a lantern lifted against the weather, steady and brave. Think of a chalkboard telling you to rest and take its advice. Rest is also a kind of work, and tomorrow will be waiting, patient and bright, on the other side of sleep.